The corridor smelled of recycled air, and something the Vorath had added to it. A faint chemical sweetness that humans weren't supposed to be able to detect, but that Mara Chen had been detecting for 31 days. She'd counted them in scratches on the wall behind the waste unit, where the patrol drones couldn't see. 31 marks. 31 mornings of waking to the same view. The gray corridor, 6 meters wide, bare alloy floors polished to a dull sheen, and across from her, separated by that corridor and 2 sets of locked doors, the cell that held Eris. They had given her a window to the corridor. She suspected this was a mistake. She suspected the Vorath thought of it as a kindness, which would have been the mistake, to believe that human prisoners needed light the way livestock needed light to keep them from going mad. They didn't understand that for Mara, that narrow rectangle of reinforced glass was not a comfort. It was a weapon. She used it every waking hour. She could see Eris's door. She couldn't see Eris, but she could see the door, and that meant she could see the shift changes of the Vorath attendants, could time the rotations, could count the seconds between the guard's departure and the hiss of the medical unit arriving to administer the neural suppression treatments. She filed it all away. In 31 days she had built a map of their schedule as complete and detailed as any nav chart she'd ever plotted. Eris would have laughed at her for it. That was the thing Mara kept returning to, in the long hours when there was nothing to do but sit and breathe and try not to hear the chemical sweetness in the air. The laugh, low, a little hoarse, startled out of Eris like she never expected anything to be funny, which made every joke feel like a gift. Mara had spent 11 years collecting those laughs. She had no intention of stopping now. The neural suppression the Vorath used on Eris was called in their records, and Mara had seen those records briefly when they'd processed her intake, a cognitive quieting protocol. It was designed for prisoners who were considered high-risk intelligences. Eris, being the senior tactical officer aboard the Meridian Asterisk, had rated very highly on whatever scale the Vorath used to measure such things. The suppression didn't damage, it silenced. It left Eris awake, aware, watching, and unable to speak, unable to move more than the minimum necessary for survival, unable to signal in any way that she was still in there. Mara knew she was still in there. She didn't need signals. On the 32nd day, the Vorath sent an attendant to speak with her. They did this periodically. She understood it to be a kind of diagnostic. The attendant was called, as far as she could transliterate, HFY, and it had 3 of the hooked forelimbs that the Vorath used for fine manipulation, and a vocal apparatus that produced standard human at a register slightly too high for comfort. It told her, as it always told her, that her cooperation would be rewarded with improved conditions. It told her that Commander Chen was a valued asset. It told her that Commander Chen should eat her nutrition rations. "I want to see Eris," Mara said. "The cognitive quieting protocol patient does not receive." "I know what the protocol says. I want to see her." HFY made the sound that Mara had come to recognize as the Vorath equivalent of a patient sigh. It left. She watched it go through the narrow glass rectangle and noted that it paused outside Eris's door for 4.3 seconds before continuing down the corridor. She added that to her map. The thing they didn't understand, the thing Mara suspected no species that had conquered 37 star systems in 4 centuries could easily understand, was that love for humans was not a comfort mechanism. It wasn't chemical bonding for the purpose of pair reproduction, or social adhesion for group survival efficiency. It was, in its truest expression, something much more dangerous. It was the thing that made humans continue past the point where any reasonable calculation said to stop. Mara had been a reasonable person once. She'd been the kind of commander who ran probability assessments before committing to any action, who believed in measured risk and proportionate response. Eris had found this hilarious. Eris had called her the most meticulous disaster she'd ever loved, and Mara had laughed until her throat hurt, and then she had made a point of being even more meticulous just to watch Eris roll her eyes. On the 30th day, Mara found the gap. It was in the timing of the medical unit's arrival, not the gap itself, but the cause of it. The unit that administered Eris's treatments ran on a rotation cycle that didn't quite synchronize with the corridor's atmospheric scrub. For 7.2 seconds after each scrub cycle, the sensors recalibrated, and in those 7.2 seconds the motion detection range in the corridor dropped by approximately 40%. It was nothing. It was almost nothing. But between Mara's cell door and Eris's, there was a service panel that the drones checked on an irregular schedule, irregular, but not random. She'd found the pattern in week 3. It took her another 4 days to fashion a tool from the bracket that held the waste unit to the wall. The bracket was titanium-adjacent composite, and she had no proper tools, and she broke 2 fingernails and reopened the cut on her palm that had been healing since day 18. She didn't rush it. Rushing was how you died. On the 43rd day, she opened the panel during the sensor recalibration window. Inside was a maintenance crawlspace, exactly as she'd calculated from the building schematic she'd memorized when they'd walked her in. 18 centimeters of clearance. She was a small woman. She had always been annoyed by this, in a vague, background way. She was the kind of person who found it difficult to be physically imposing in a briefing room. For the first time in her adult life, she was grateful. She crossed the corridor in the maintenance channel and came up through the corresponding panel on Eris's side. The panel cover on Eris's side was locked from the outside. She'd anticipated this. She'd fashioned a second tool specifically for this lock. It took her 3 minutes and 40 seconds she didn't have. She made it. The cell was identical to her own. Same dimensions, same recycled air, same dull floor. Eris was in the sleeping pod against the far wall, awake, eyes open, tracking Mara's entrance with the precision of someone who had been watching the door for 6 weeks. Mara sat beside the pod. She didn't speak for a moment. She just looked at Eris's face, at the lines around her eyes that she'd memorized long before they were ever prisoners, at the particular way Eris was breathing, at the tiny compression of the muscles at the corner of her mouth that wasn't quite a smile, but was the nearest Eris could currently manage. "Hi," Mara said. Eris couldn't respond. The suppression wouldn't allow it. But Eris's eyes moved, a specific, deliberate movement, a slow blink and a slight upward cast that between them had always meant something like, "You impossible, terrible, wonderful person." Mara understood it perfectly. She had approximately 12 minutes before the next patrol rotation. She used 11 of them simply being in the room. She counted Eris's breaths. She told Eris, in a quiet voice that wouldn't reach the corridor sensors, what she'd learned about the guard rotations, the sensor windows, the maintenance grid. She told her the escape route she was building. She explained the 3 alternative contingencies. She told it the way she'd told mission briefs for 11 years, precise and structured. And she could see Eris tracking every word with the focused attention that had made her the best tactical officer in the 4th Fleet. Then she said, because she had 1 minute left, "We danced to that song from the old Rome archives. You remember. You'd found it in the cultural database, the one from the 2060s, and you played it on the mess deck speakers, and everyone thought you'd lost your mind." Eris's eyes, that infinitesimal shift at the corner of her mouth. "I'm going to get us out," Mara said, "and then I'm going to make you dance to it again, somewhere with actual gravity, somewhere that isn't this." She went back through the panel with 45 seconds to spare. The Vorath's fundamental error, and she'd come to think of it as an almost elegant error, the kind that came from certainty rather than malice, was that they understood human persistence as stubbornness, which they modeled as a temporary state that would yield to sufficient pressure. This was accurate for most things. It was not accurate for this. Stubbornness operated on the principle that the stubborn party would eventually be worn down. What Mara was operating on was not stubbornness. It was something quieter and more absolute. It didn't wear. She had started visiting every 3rd day, then every other day, and by day 60 she was going every day, and she had refined the crossing time to 40 seconds and the return to 38. She brought things when she could. A piece of the nutrition ration that had a consistency Eris had always preferred. Once, a small smooth stone she'd found lodged in the maintenance channel, which she placed in Eris's hand and watched Eris's fingers curl around it, with an effort that had to have taken everything the suppression allowed. She also, during this period, very carefully and very patiently, dismantled the behavioral model the Vorath had constructed for her. She ate her rations. She slept on schedule. She responded to HFY-7's diagnostic visits with a degree of cooperative affect that she calibrated precisely, enough to reduce their concern level, not so much as to seem suspicious. The Vorath were extremely intelligent. She gave them no reason to re-examine their assumptions. She was a cooperative prisoner in manageable distress. She was exactly what their models predicted. She was also, at the same time, memorizing the complete duty roster for the detention block, the maintenance schedule for the docking bay 2 levels up, the structural weak points in the block's atmospheric containment system, and the override sequence for the suppression emitters. The last item had taken her longest. She'd gotten the emitter schematic from a piece of discarded technical documentation that had been used as packing material in a supply delivery, which she had requested under the guise of wanting something to read, which HFY-7 had arranged because the Vorath genuinely did not understand that humans could read technical documentation and extract useful information from it. This was the other thing they had miscalculated. They thought they understood humans because they had conquered a lot of them, but conquering a species is not the same as knowing it. You learn from conquest what a species does under maximum pressure at the moment of defeat. You don't learn what it does quietly, in the middle, in the long maintenance period of captivity, when it is building something inside itself that you cannot see. On day 79, Mara was ready. She told Eris everything in the session the night before. She watched Eris's face as she walked through it, every step, every timing, every contingency. She watched the moment when Eris understood what she was proposing, and the expression shifted from focused attention to something sharper, something that in another context Mara would have called alarm. "I know," Mara said. "I know what you're thinking." Eris's eyes said, "This is insane." "Yes," Mara agreed, "but I've been insane for 11 years. You knew that when you kept me around." Something happened in Eris's face then. It wasn't quite a smile still. The suppression held the muscles too firmly for that. But it was something in the eyes, something Mara had no word for except the one she'd always used privately, which was home. She went back through the panel. She slept 3 hours. She rose at the window that her schedule analysis said was the blind spot in the block's overnight monitoring, the 40-minute gap between the end of the second night rotation and the beginning of the automated dawn cycle, and she went to work. The atmospheric containment system was the first domino. She didn't damage it catastrophically. She introduced a fault that the system would interpret as a sensor malfunction, triggering an automated maintenance alert that would pull 2 of the 3 corridor guards to the utility junction on level 3. The Vorath were methodical. They would respond to the alert on schedule because their systems were very good, and they trusted their systems because their systems had always been trustworthy. The emitter override was the harder piece. She'd practiced the sequence in her head so many times that her fingers moved before she consciously directed them, sliding through the maintenance panel access point and reaching the emitter relay by touch in the dark. 40 seconds. The suppression field for the block dropped. Not permanently, 12 minutes, maybe 15 before the backup system noticed, but that was enough. That had always been enough. She heard Eris move before she heard anything else. The sound of someone who has been still for 80 days suddenly not being still, a sharp intake of breath, the controlled crash of a body remembering it could be controlled. Mara was already pulling the panel open on Eris's side from the inside access she'd mapped on day 62. Eris looked at her. really looked at her in a way that was different from the watchful attention of the past weeks, in a way that had the full use of her face behind it. Her voice, when it came, was wrecked from disuse and still the most specific sound in Mara's entire life. "You," Eris said, "are the most meticulous disaster I have ever loved." "I know," Mara said. "Move." They moved. Mara had planned 3 routes and they took the third, the one she'd built as a contingency for the contingency, down through the maintenance grid, past the Level 2 power relay, through a section of the ship that the Voreth used as cold storage for equipment requisitioned from captured vessels. She found what she was looking for in the third storage bay, components from the Meridian Asterisk, pulled from the wreckage and kept, she supposed, as technical study material. Among them was a portable signal emitter, rated for short-range fleet comms. "Tell me this works," Eris said, breathing hard, watching the corridor behind them. Mara looked at the emitter's charge indicator, looked at the schematic she'd memorized from the tech documentation. 63% chance. That's your 63%, or the real 63%. This is the real 63%. "Good," Eris said. "Those are fine odds." The signal went out on the 4th Fleet emergency frequency. Mara didn't know if anyone was listening. She didn't know if there was a 4th Fleet anymore. In 80 days of captivity, she'd received precisely no information about the broader war. She did know that the signal would eventually be detected by the Voreth's own monitoring, which meant they had somewhere between 4 and 7 minutes before the block went a full alert. They had a place to be. The docking bay was on level 1. She'd calculated it from the ship's vibration patterns during approach and departure, the kind of thing that a tactical commander noticed and filed away, and that a meticulous disaster turned into a floor plan. There were 2 Voreth scout vessels in the bay. She'd picked the smaller one on day 50, on the basis of access time and the likelihood that its departure authorization protocols were locally cached rather than server-dependent. She was right about the protocols. She was also wrong, slightly, about the response time. The alert came at 3 minutes 40, not 4, which meant they were still sealing the hatch when the first Voreth security unit reached the bay doors. "I see 3, Eris said, from the co-pilot seat, hands already moving across the unfamiliar controls with the focused, unhurried certainty that had always made her extraordinary. "There'll be more in 30 seconds. Then we should not be here in 30 seconds. They were not. Scout vessel was fast for its size. Not fast enough to outrun a Voreth pursuit formation. Mara knew that, and Eris knew that, and they both knew the signal might have reached no one, or might have reached someone who couldn't respond in time, or might have reached someone who was already gone. She'd had no illusions going in. She'd gone in anyway, because the calculation she'd been running for 80 days had never been about survival probability. It had been about something simpler and less quantifiable. It had been about the specific, non-negotiable requirement that she not leave Eris behind. The pursuit formation came out of the Voreth carrier vessel at 2 minutes 12 seconds. 7 ships, standard intercept pattern. Mara watched them on the scanner and ran the numbers and came to the same number she'd known she would come to. Not good. "Eris," she said, "I see them. If we change heading 15 degrees starboard, there's a debris field from, I think it's from us, actually, from the Meridian Asterisk. Sensor scattering. Buys us maybe 4 minutes. 4 minutes for what?" Mara didn't answer, because at that moment the scanner showed something else. Multiple contacts. Fast, coming from the debris field's far side, with IFF signatures that made her eyes sting in a way she hadn't expected and couldn't entirely account for. 3rd Fleet. What was left of it, anyway? 3 cruisers and a frigate, and they were burning hard in a way that suggested someone had received the signal, and someone had been close enough to respond, and someone had decided that 4-to-1 odds against a Voreth intercept formation were acceptable. They were more than acceptable. The engagement lasted 9 minutes. Mara and Eris spent it in the scout vessel's debris field, running silent, watching on passive sensors. At the end of it, the Vorath formation had withdrawn, and the Third Fleet's lead cruiser was broadcasting on the recovery channel, and the sound of a human voice on a human frequency was so abrupt and so total that Mara sat in the co-pilot seat for a long moment and couldn't do anything with it. Eris reached across the console and put her hand over Mara's. Mara turned her hand over and held it. They sat like that for a while in the silent scout vessel, in the debris of the ship they'd served on together for 11 years, in the wreckage of one of the worst 80 days of Mara's life, while the recovery crew came to find them. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't a speech or a triumph or anything she would have designed if she'd had the option. It was just the two of them and the weight of all the days in it, and the specific quality of Eris's hand in hers that she had never been able to explain to anyone and had never needed to. Later, much later, in the recovery debrief, when the analyst wanted to understand how a single prisoner with no equipment had engineered an escape from a maximum classification Vorath detention facility, Mara would try to explain the gap in their thinking. The gap the Vorath had never closed in all their centuries of conquest. She'd been told the analyst had studied human behavior for years. She'd been told they were very thorough. They had charts. They had probability tables. They had extensive documentation of human responses to extreme duress. The error, she said, was thinking I was trying to survive. What were you trying to do? Mara thought about 31 marks on a wall, about a smooth stone in an open hand, about a laugh she'd been collecting for 11 years and wasn't finished collecting yet. Get back to someone, she said. The analyst wrote it down. She wasn't sure it helped them understand. She suspected it didn't, and that this was fine, and that this particular gap would remain a gap for a very long time, because the thing that lived in it wasn't a tactic or a technique. It wasn't a survival mechanism that could be modeled or a behavioral pattern that could be suppressed or a weakness that could be exploited. It was the thing that made humans do the math differently. That rewrote the variables at the foundation level, so that equations the Vorath solved as impossible came out, for humans, with a different answer. The analyst asked what would happen if they removed the variable, if they ensured that prisoners had nothing to get back to. Mara looked at them for a moment. Then you'd have made us angry, she said, and that's the other thing you don't want. Outside the debriefing room, Eris was waiting. She had a cup of something hot and she handed it over without ceremony, the way she'd handed over 1,000 cups in 11 years of side-by-side service, the way she would, Mara thought, hand over cups for however many years came next. She put her shoulder against Mara's in the corridor and didn't say anything, because she didn't need to. They walked toward the light at the end of the corridor. It wasn't Rome, but it was a start.